So this video doesn't really need much of an introduction, unless you're the type of person who clicks on videos without reading the title. In that case, may I present the worst argument for God. Premise 1. Grass is orange. Premise 2. Flibaboli Wadzu. Conclusion. As you can see, this is an absolutely awful argument for God. Premise 1 isn't even true. Premise 2 is pure gibberish as opposed to an actual statement. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, and as you can see, the conclusion doesn't even claim that God exists. Instead, clearly being a painting of Vercingetorix surrendering to Julius Caesar. But maybe looking for the worst argument for God isn't a very productive exercise. After all, anything can technically be declared an argument for God, and the less credible that claim, the worse it is as an argument. I could point to a raindrop on my window and say that it's an argument for God. And you might say that it's not an argument for God, but I would simply say that it's just a really bad argument for God. So perhaps we should slightly qualify our criteria here. What we want is the worst argument for God, which is generally taken seriously by people with an interest in the debate. And I would posit that if we apply this criteria, then the worst argument for God is the moral argument. Now, if you're a sneaky person who likes to frame the debate in your favour, then there is one sense in which the moral argument might serve to benefit you. See, the moral argument can often be misunderstood, and you may find that upon presenting the argument, the person you're talking to fails to understand the argument and declares, "So you're saying that atheists can't be moral then, are you?" And then, of course, you get to triumphantly correct your opponent's misunderstanding of the argument, thus making you appear smarter. This is what I mean when I say it's a good trick if you want to frame the debate in your favour. That's a good trick in general. Make an argument that can be easily misunderstood, and that way you get to make your opponent appear stupid when they misunderstand it, and you get to correct them. And of course, if you're trying to argue against somebody presenting this argument, then you don't want to make this mistake. So let's just make sure we understand what the argument is saying. A good summation for the moral argument can be found in C.S. Lewis's famous book, Mere Christianity. This is, by the way, what I mean when I say this argument is taken very seriously by people. Mere Christianity is often considered to be one of the best apologetics books out there. In lieu of a concise quote, he essentially makes the inductive argument that it seems when people argue on points of morality, they are not simply appealing to their own standards, nor the standards of the person they're arguing against, but instead appealing to some standard which supersedes the personal disposition of the two arguing. This is to say, they're appealing to an objective standard. The way I like to think of it is that there are two levels to reality, or dimensions if you like, one concerning what we believe, and the other concerning what is actually true. For example, if I say that the 30 Years' War ended in 1642, and another person says it ended in 1648, then we know that there is an answer beyond the argument. There is a year when it objectively ended that all historians agree on. 1648 if you're curious, but I often get it confused with the start of the English Civil War, which was in 1642. If one person believes the Earth is 6,000 years old, and everything was created pretty much as it is in its current form by God, while another person believes that the Earth is more like 4 billion years old, and the current life forms we see today evolved over hundreds of millions of years, then we know that this level, the objective level, exists for that question. We know that there is an objective answer. Only an idiot would declare that there is not an objective answer. Some points of fact. Firstly, being polite doesn't negate the existence of this objective layer. You can by all means say, "We'll agree to disagree," if you find that your granddad's mind has been so poisoned by the right-wing press that he can't accept the obvious fact that anthropogenic climate change is a thing. But that you've said you'll agree to disagree doesn't mean that you've agreed that there is no correct answer, and even if you had agreed that, you'd be wrong. Similarly, sometimes the objective answer can be ambiguous. It may be, for example, that the answer lies halfway between two positions, or that both positions are correct, depending on how you define different terms. However, still, ambiguous does not preclude objective. And it may be that the answer is not practically knowable. I don't make much of Sam Harris's opinions on most things, but he has a quite useful analogy for this point. No person right now could know how many birds are currently flying at this exact moment. Nobody could put a confident, objective number on how many birds are currently in the sky. But that objective number still nonetheless exists. Now, the question is, are there any areas where there is no objective layer? Where the subjective is all that there is? There are several areas where the answer is maybe. For example, most people believe that film and music preferences are subjective, but there are some people who firmly believe that there is an objective dimension to such aesthetic judgments. For example, if one person's favourite film is The Godfather, and another person's favourite film is Transformers: Age of Extinction, there are some out there who believe that in the objective level, we will find the incontrovertible truth that The Godfather is the superior film. Now, I personally find that claim to be doubtful, and I actually think there's a whole other video worth making to describe what I would call pseudo-objectivity, which is to say, criteria which are not objective, but reminiscent of objectivity. For example, the difference between Godfather and Age of Extinction seems much more objective than the difference between Fargo and The Big Lebowski. However, to avoid having to negotiate the rather sticky question of whether or not such judgments can be objective, I'm going to put that to one side. I suppose it's worth taking a brief moment to point out something important. Consensus and objectivity have nothing to do with each other. Even if it were the case that everybody agreed that The Godfather was the better film, that would not cause the judgment to be objective. And likewise, disagreement doesn't prove that a matter is not objective. And if you take only one message from this video, then let it be that you never appeal to disagreement over morality as proof that morality is subjective. Now, for my firmly established example of something which I believe can be considered uncontroversially objective, consider one's favourite colour. So, for example, one person's favourite colour is green, and the other person's favourite colour is blue. I hope you at least will be willing to accept this as an example of a debate that is purely subjective. You can search around in that objective world for as long as you like, but you're never going to find an objective answer to the question, what is the better colour, green or blue? So let this be our go-to example of a subjective debate. Now, what about morality? I once saw on Reddit a debate between two people on the subject of abortion. One was pro-choice, the other pro-life. And the pro-life person declared, perhaps we can't know whether or not abortion is immoral, but I believe that when in doubt, we should always err on the side of life. The pro-choice person then said, I agree, we can't know, but I believe we should always err on the side of freedom. And that was near enough the conclusion of the argument. But they had both assumed in their closing statements an important thing, that whether or not abortion was moral is something that can be known. Which is to say that if we went searching through the objective world, we would find an answer to the question, is abortion moral? And that is objective morality. The alternative, subjective morality, would be to say that the debate over whether abortion is wrong is ontologically equivalent to a debate over what colour is best. Now, the moral argument concerns the question of whether or not you will find the answer to moral questions in the objective world, or is the subjective opinion of humans all there is to it? Most commonly, the argument is put like so. Premise 1. If morality is objective, God exists. Premise 2. Morality is objective. Conclusion. God exists. Now, you see, therefore, how silly it is to mistake the moral argument for an argument declaring that atheists cannot be moral. The moral argument instead suggests that, within an atheistic framework, morality has no objective truth, and therefore saying, who are you to say I can't be moral just because I'm an atheist, is no more forceful a question than, who are you to say I don't like the best colour just because I'm an atheist? According to the argument, if there is no God, then questions concerning morality become ontologically equivalent to questions concerning the best colour. Now, if we look at the argument, we can see it does have something going for it. Firstly, the conclusion actually does declare that God exists, which is handy in an argument for God. But secondly, the conclusion actually does follow from the premises, although that's not very impressive when the premises essentially boil down to premise 1, if X, Y, premise 2, X, conclusion, Y. So the conclusion is valid providing that the premises are true, provided that the premises are true indeed. You see, there are actually 3 premises here. It seems like 2, but it's actually 3, because the first premise contains within it 2 premises. Premise 1a. A theistic worldview can account for the objectivity of morality. Premise 1b. An atheistic worldview cannot account for the objectivity of morality. And of course, the familiar premise 2, morality is objective. If any of these premises fail, then the argument fails. If a theistic worldview can account for objective morality, and an atheistic worldview cannot, but morality is not objective, then the argument fails. If morality is objective, and a theistic worldview can account for objective morality, but it can't be satisfactorily demonstrated that an atheistic worldview cannot, then the argument fails. And if it can be satisfactorily demonstrated that an atheistic worldview cannot account for objective morality, and that morality is objective, but it also can't be satisfactorily demonstrated that a theistic worldview can account for objective morality either, then the argument fails. And a theistic argument for the objectivity of morality is really tenuous. The main argument for it is that God is definitionally perfect, and God has a sense of morality, and since God is definitionally perfect, his morality must be definitionally perfect too. A classic objection to a theistic framework for objective morality is the urethro dilemma, which essentially asks where God's morality comes from. If God's morality is objective because it coheres with what is obviously correct, then there must be some standard above God to determine what is objectively correct, which is to say, God must be in the subjective layer in order for there to be an objective layer above him to affirm that what God declares moral is in fact moral. Alternatively, if God's morality is intrinsically correct just because he declares it to be so, then that would appear to have the character of subjective morality, that is only true insofar as God believes it to be so. Now, I should say that I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm not as well read as I need to be, and thus I encourage you not to take what I'm saying as the be-all and end-all of this discussion. I most definitely hope to explore this topic in more detail when I have time to incorporate lengthy research projects into this channel, and I will return back to this issue. But for now, I am putting this entire question to one side for a minute, and that in itself shows part of the problem with the moral argument. This premise is a significant part of the argument, and it is an incredibly tenuous claim in itself. But we can put that aside completely and still handily defeat this argument. So, how do we defeat this argument? Well, first of all, let's suppose that we deny the second premise. We say, I do not accept the second premise, and I do not believe that morality is objective. Well, naturally, what do you do when somebody denies a premise of your argument? Of course, you attempt to prove the premise. So the theist must now try to incontrovertibly demonstrate that morality is objective. But also, of course, they must do so without appealing to God. As to do so would be to make a circular argument. They can't assume God exists in order to prove morality is objective, in order to prove God exists. But still, this theist is a very good debater. And they are able to prove to you, beyond all doubt, that objective morality exists. And they are able to do so without appealing to God to demonstrate the existence of objective morality. So you say, right, I'm convinced, I believe morality is objective. What was the first premise again? And the theist replies, well, the first premise was that if morality is objective, God exists. So you say, right, why? And they'll reply, well, because we need a theistic framework in order to coherently maintain that objective morality exists. Without a theistic framework, there is no way you could justifiably believe that objective morality exists. Objective morality requires a theistic framework. And then you say, but don't you remember, you just showed me with your utterly fantastic argument that we could coherently maintain that objective morality exists, and that we could believe so justifiably, and your argument did not require an appeal to the existence of God, at which point the apologist will say, oh, you're right, I did. And this, in my humble submission, represents the essential self-destructive nature of this argument for God. You must prove that objective morality exists. But to do so, you must not suppose that God exists, or else your argument would be circular. And you must then argue that the only way to justifiably believe that morality is objective is to suppose that God exists, which is to say that in proving the second premise, you disprove the first one. Now, there are some arguments that I can foresee being made here. The first and most obvious would be to point out that you can demonstrate a point and extrapolate from that point some other point. After all, my whole argument is centered on a supposed contradiction in the moral argument, that to demonstrate that objective morals exist without God is automatically setting one up for defeat in terms of proving God from the premise that objective morals exist. As I said, this would inevitably be circular. But somebody might say, hold on a minute. You can prove that we can find different animals in different rock layers all over the world without appealing to evolution. But it is only evolution that can adequately explain why we find different animals in different rock layers all over the world. Isn't it then also true that you could prove that morality is objective without appealing to a theistic worldview, but it is only a theistic worldview that can adequately explain why morality is objective? This is true, sort of, but it has problems both in practice and in principle. In practice, the only argument I've ever seen to prove morality is objective amounts to the claim that people act as if morality is objective. That's the argument we see C.S. Lewis use. Alternatively, there's the argument presented by David Enoch in his somewhat presumptuously titled essay, Why I'm an Objectivist About Ethics and Why You Are Too. He lays out his famous spinach argument. A child says that they were glad that they didn't like spinach, because if they liked spinach, they'd eat more of it. And that would be bad, since the child doesn't like spinach. Well, of course, we understand that this is absurd, since whether or not they like spinach is the be-all and end-all of whether or not eating spinach would be a bad thing. So if they did like spinach and they ate spinach, then there'd be no cause for concern. Alternatively, a physicist said that they're glad that they don't live in a time when people thought the sun revolved around the earth. And we understand this is not absurd, because the physics of the universe is objective, and a physicist being ignorant to the nature of the universe would be an objective loss. And then somebody else says that they're glad that they were not raised in the antebellum US South, because then they may have been indoctrinated into believing that slavery was okay. This does not seem absurd, because we understand that the immorality of slavery is external to that person's particular beliefs about slavery, and therefore to believe wrongly that slavery is okay would be as much of an objective loss as for the physicist to believe wrongly that the sun orbits the earth. Or so the argument goes. Now, there are some problems with this argument. Firstly, that it splits belief into two categories, objective and subjective, and concludes that if a belief is treated like an objective belief, then it must be objective. However, it ignores the possibility that there may be multiple categories of subjective beliefs, most immediately obvious being strong subjective beliefs and weak subjective beliefs. For example, I am happy that I'm not a racist. I very much would not want to be a racist. I also believe racism should be opposed. I believe people on all levels of society should be encouraged not to be racist, right down to the education of children. Likewise, I am happy that I don't believe evolution is a hoax. I very much enjoy having a firm understanding of humanity's place in the cosmic order. I believe that so-called creationist science should be opposed. I believe people on all levels of society should be encouraged to accept scientific truths like evolution, right down to the education of children. But by contrast, if my tongue suddenly decides to start enjoying the taste of licorice, that's fine by me. I don't personally like the taste of licorice, so I personally avoid it. But I have no problem with other people enjoying it, and were I to suddenly start enjoying it, that would be fine. Now sure, this does place the moral position of opposing racism alongside the objective scientific position of believing in evolution. But consider for a minute another example. I am happy that I don't enjoy lazy, uninspired films. I am very happy that I'm not the type of person who immediately dismisses unconventional films. I am firmly against such a limited view of film as an art form, and I believe that people on all levels of society should be encouraged to watch artistic and intelligent films right down to the education of children in robust media criticism. So, does this mean that my opinion on films is now objective? Maybe Enoch would accept that, but we can also explain all of this by simply positing that some subjective judgments are held to more strongly than others. And to say that a belief can't be subjective because it's dissimilar to some of our less deeply held subjective preferences is uncompelling. And all of this is ignoring the fact that this argument boils down to people treat morality like it's objective, therefore it's objective. And this seems to be the only real argument we have. William Lane Craig, when asked to prove objective morality, tells a story of a student who wrote an essay arguing that morality is not objective. In response to this, the professor gave him an F, even though the essay was good. And the student indignantly said that the professor was not being fair, to which the professor responds by accusing the student of hypocrisy, since he just argued that morals are not objective.
And the student said, "But that's not fair! You can't do that." And the professor said, "It's not what? Isn't this the paper that argued that there is no such thing as fairness and moral rightness and wrongness?" And all of a sudden the student got the point.
Again, this relies on the assumption that you can only be insistent upon objective preferences, and also it argues that because the student acted as if objective morals exist, it therefore follows that objective morality must exist. The main problem here seems quite obvious, and it's a problem with the principle of the argument. Objective morality is a nebulous concept. It's not something you can find physically in reality, and I would suggest that this creates an inescapable predicament. You can't demonstrate objective morality without justifying objective morality. Consider for a minute if you were to ask a mathematician to demonstrate that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You'd get some kind of mathematical proof to demonstrate that 2 plus 2 equals 4. If you then said, "Now I want you to justify that 2 plus 2 equals 4, they'd respond by saying, "What do you think I just did?" To demonstrate it is to justify it, because it's a reality which is justified by the very fact that it's been demonstrated to exist. And this, I'd contend, is the same situation we find ourselves in with objective morality. You quite simply cannot demonstrate it without justifying it. Now, there is an elephant in the room here. Some theists might say, well, this is all well and good, but what about the atheists who do believe in objective morality? Indeed, some atheists might say that my rebuttal thus far is insufficient, since it relies on rejecting objective morality, which is something that not all atheists do. So, Let's imagine for a minute that you find an atheist who believes in objective morality. Maybe they have a shit reason like Sam Harris, or maybe they have an actual good reason like most other philosophers. But the point is that no matter how valid their reasoning is, they accept that objective morals exist. And let's suppose that it is Sam Harris, somebody whose opinions on metaethics are woefully inchoate. That's making it very easy for the Christian. They could be up against a much more threatening intellect, but they're up against Sam Harris, fortunately. So let's grant that you, atheist, are able to convince Sam Harris that his justification for objective morality does not work. Indeed, the only way he can continue to believe in objective morality is to adopt a theistic framework. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think he's going to fall on his knees and become a theist? No, he's going to say, "Oh, thank you, you've convinced me that morality is not objective." I mean, think about this. If you are an atheist and you believe in objective morality, and somebody is able to convince you that in order to continue to believe in objective morality, you must accept the existence of a God which has not been in any other way demonstrated to you, what's going to crack first? Your belief in objective morality, or your belief in a God you see no reason to believe in? Proving to somebody beyond any doubt that they cannot believe in objective morality within an atheistic framework is never going to convince them that God exists before it convinces them that objective morality doesn't exist. Because the only reason they initially believed in objective morality is because they established some kind of atheistic basis for believing in objective morality. So before you can do anything else, you must show that their atheistic basis for believing in objective morality is not valid. And if you succeed at that, then you've taken them back to square one. So here we have the flip side to the self-defeating essence of the argument. If somebody does not believe in objective morality, then you must demonstrate to them that morality is objective. Since to appeal to God in such an argument would be circular, you must demonstrate that morality is objective without appealing to God. And then, having convinced them that morality is objective without appealing to God, you must then convince them that one cannot believe morality is objective without believing in God. And indeed, if you meet an atheist who already believes that morality is objective, then the first thing you must do is convince them that their reasoning for believing that morality is objective is insufficient. This is the only way that you can convince them that only a theistic framework allows for morality to be objective. But once you've convinced them that their reasoning for believing that morality is objective is insufficient, they will simply cease to believe in objective morality, which takes you back over to the other side. So the only way that this argument could possibly work is if you are speaking to somebody who is very stupid, somebody who could have their reason for believing in objective morality knocked down, but then still continue to believe in objective morality without justification before then accepting the existence of God in order to continue to believe in objective morality, even though they have now accepted that their initial reason for believing in objective morality was heretofore without justification. And this is assuming that they had a justification for believing in objective morality in the first place. In other words, we find ourselves with an argument that only works if somebody willingly believes something which they have no justification for. Which essentially means that we have an argument that amounts to little more than a fancier way of telling people to just believe without evidence or justification. But the argument not only works against the very stupid, but also against the very easily manipulated. And this leads on to the most unsavory aspect of this argument. In my opinion, the primary purpose of this argument is not to win people over with its inescapable, airtight logic. The primary purpose of this argument is to manipulate, pressure, and undermine. Because if you say that you don't believe in objective morality, then firstly, the person you're talking to will most likely appeal to emotions. They will say, imagine if such and such horrible thing happened to your family. Wouldn't you agree that this is objectively immoral? This argument is a massive appeal to emotion. If you find yourself in an argument where the person you're arguing with has to appeal to something that will trigger really intense emotions in you, then the chances are you are not up against a winning argument. But how stupid would you have to be for this argument to work on you? For this to work, you'd have to believe that morality is subjective, but also have never considered the possibility that something bad might happen to you or those you love. You'd have to say, oh, I used to think morality was subjective, but it never once occurred to me that somebody might do something bad to me, and obviously in that case I'd consider that to be objectively immoral. Clearly, if that scenario has never occurred to you, then you didn't think that much about the issue. And an argument that can only convince people who haven't thought about their position at all is a bad argument. Secondly, the person will appeal to pressure by referring to generally bad things like sexual assault and murder and maybe even the Holocaust. The point is that if you're very weak and lack integrity, then you'd fold under this pressure and say, well, I can't stand the fact that it might sound bad to say I can't say that the Holocaust was objectively immoral, therefore I accept objective morality. Again, this argument is not only bad, but also reflects very poorly on the integrity of the person making the argument. And thirdly, we have the final purpose of this argument, in my opinion, to undermine. Because if somebody doesn't give in to social pressure and they actually stick to their guns, then the person who's arguing against them will drive the point home. So you're saying that the Holocaust was not objectively wrong? You're saying that Hitler's subjective moral values were not objectively more wrong than anybody else's? And the subtext here is clear. Well, I've won because what you said sounds a bit dodgy. And that's why the moral argument offends me so much, because it's not just a bad argument, but I would argue that the majority of the time when it's used, it's actually an immoral argument. It's not really designed to convince people using logic. As we've seen, if you use logic alone, the argument fails on pretty much every level. However, it's designed to weaponize emotion. Firstly, by appealing to your deeply held emotions, then by appealing to the societal pressure to declare certain things as objectively wrong, and then finally, to shame and undermine you, possibly even in front of an audience, to distract from the total failure of an argument. And that's it. But believe it or not, I have a whole other 2 videos I want to make just on this argument alone. Firstly, of course, that video on the idea that theistic morals can be objective, which is something that, as I said, I want to look into more at some point. But then in addition to that, much sooner, there will be a video on the use of the moral argument as a counter-argument. For example, if somebody points out that the problem of evil, then often apologists will say, well, how can you appeal to evil if you don't believe in objective morality? And this will also be an opportunity to explore the idea that we need objective morals in order to have meaningful morality at all. So this video is not complete. There is a second part to come, and on top of that, I will probably make more videos on good and bad arguments for atheism and theism in the future. These are all very good reasons to subscribe. Clearly my pronunciation isn't very good though. These are all very good reasons to subscribe, and if you like this content, then drop a like and comment to let me know your thoughts. Follow me on Twitter and also share this video with your friends. And finally, last but not least, if you want to see videos that involve research, then Patreon is the best way to go. Everything that I do on this channel so far is based on the reading that I did at university and earlier on in my life. Since I've started working and making videos, I've had so little time to research that there are loads of videos that I'm holding off on because I want them to be big research projects. I'm not talking about just the odd article or even book here and there. I'm talking about big research projects. That's what I want to eventually start doing more and more of on this channel, and even $1 from you would help. I don't usually push my Patreon so aggressively, but I think it's appropriate here since this is the type of area where I really want to do some more research and start producing content that is engaging and informative for you guys. So thank you. Thank you to my patrons, Eric Hernandez, Finnegan Flan, Stephen Lester, LRX89, Nancy D, Hannah Taylor, Kirsten, Stephen, Ben Name, and Thz, which I'm guessing is how you pronounce your name. It's a thorn, that old Anglo-Saxon symbol, and an S, so Thz is how you'll be known. Thank you. You're all very appreciated.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!